Jordan Peterson had this spicy interaction with a student at Oxford. What I want to try to do here is to give my most charitable interpretation of both sides. So bear with me. If something I say does not sound like it's in support of Jordan Peterson, it's not because I think Jordan Peterson was at fault here. It's simply because I'm trying to be as fair as possible. I'm trying to put myself in both his shoes and the shoes of the questioner, who I think most people watching this video will agree came off completely from the left field. So with that said, let's jump into this video.
Hello.
Hello. My question is in regards to a comment you made on Joe Rogan's podcast a couple years prior, where you called being transgender a sociological contagion and compared trans people to Satanists. To Satanists.
No, I don't think so.
You called being transgender equivalent to participating in satanic rituals in the 1980s. This is a quote.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
You called being transgender and you compared that to satanic rituals that occurred in daycares in the 1980s.
I see. So
yeah.
That's very...
She said that was a quote, and she said he compared transgender people, to satanists, people who practice satanic rituals. And I found this video that she's referencing. I want people watching to have the actual reference and not just my word. So let's watch exactly how he worded this in that video.
And so teenagers are wired to go along with the crowd. And then if the crowd is offering something pathological, that happens all the time. You get a psychological epidemic. And I knew that. I told you. I told the Senate this in 2017. And why did I know? Well, I knew the literature. We've tracked psychological epidemics going back 300 years. 300 years. Here's some of them. Multiple personality disorder. It cycles in society. Disappears, then there's one case, then it spreads like mad. Then there's multiple personality disorder everywhere. Teenage girls mostly. Then people get skeptical about it, and it dies. And maybe it disappears for a whole generation or two. Then a case pops up. Just does this. That's happened for 300 years. Cutting was a psychological epidemic. Bulimia was a psychological epidemic. Anorexia was a psychological epidemic. The satanic daycare ritual abuse accusations that came out in the 1980s, that was a psychological epidemic. And the rule basically is that if you confuse people about a fundamental element of their identity, then those who are already so confused they're barely hanging on are going to fall prey to that, and all hell's going to break loose. And that's exactly what's happened in the trans situation.
Okay, so now with that context, let's rewatch this question and figure out how fair a representation of Jordan Peterson's comments was it exactly?
My question is in regards to a comment you made on Joe Rogan's podcast a couple years prior, where you called being transgender a sociological contagion and compared trans people to Satanists. To Satanists.
No, I don't think so.
You called being transgender equivalent to participating in satanic rituals in the 1980s. This is a quote.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
You called being transgender and you compared that to satanic rituals that occurred in daycares in the 1980s.
I see. So that's very different than the proposition that you laid before.
You can tell she's fumbling over her words because she's trying to draw a connection where none exists. She's trying to quote him where a quote doesn't exist. Okay, social contagion, fair so far, we can say, but crucially, he did not say that all of transgenderism is explained by social contagion. What he was saying was that while there are frank elements of transgenderism out there, while there are people who genuinely do not fit into the biological sex that they're born with, that the increasing prevalence of transgenderism is explicable with the social contagion phenomena, as we've seen in so many different cases. This is a very crucial difference because if you misinterpret him for whatever reason as saying that transgenderism is exclusively caused by a social contagion, then of course you're going to be upset with him. If he did in fact say that, that would be upsetting to people who do have that frank condition, because it completely minimizes a very difficult, I would imagine, condition that they've been born with.
Oh, no. Oh, I see. I see. So
Yeah.
that's very different than the proposition that you laid before me.
Right.
No,
You do have a history of
seriously different.
intense anti-trans comments, so I wanted to question you on that. In the United States, trans youth have the highest rates of suicide among any demographic. How do you respond to those who believe your comments have cultivated a climate of hostility against trans people and contributed to this alarming rise in suicide rates?
Okay, so first of all, I respond to them like I responded to you by pointing out the falsehood of their question. The question you asked me had absolutely nothing to do with what I said, as you well knew. And the
I just
moralizing
want to
element,
emphasize,
and the moralizing element of your accusation that constituted the last half of your question is also equally ill formulated. You have no idea what you're talking about. The idea that my comments had anything to do with the hypothetical rise in suicide rates among transgender people is preposterous. And there's also no evidence whatsoever that those suicide rates that you're describing are a consequence of any attitude whatsoever towards their hypothetically transgender
lack
status.
of social acceptance, which is definitely cultivated by comments like yours that deny the existence of trans people.
What makes you think you know what you're talking about?
So first of all, that was not a quote. Jordan Peterson obviously did not say that satanic rituals are equivalent to transgenderism, as she just stated. Secondly, it is barely a paraphrase, because it is missing the crucial context, which is important here, that he is talking about social contagions. He's not making a contrast between transgenderism and satanic rituals, right? He's talking about examples of social contagions in which we have transgenderism, we have satanic rituals, we have bulimia, we have anorexia. Interestingly, she didn't point out any of the other benign, I say benign loosely here, benign conditions that have been vulnerable to social contagion, like the ones he mentioned about eating disorders, and rather went for the jugular with satanic rituals. So this begs the question, why the ill-formed accusation? Because that's what this was. To its core, this was not a question, even though it might have had the facade of one. Why would you take someone out of context? Why would you misquote them and present that to them in the pretext of a question? And the only explanation that I can think of is that she evidently knows that that is not what he said, and yet still feels bothered by it. So it must be that the portion of transgenderism that he is attributing to a social contagion must be what bothers her. I mean, that is what he said. So that must be what bothers her. But why is that troubling? Why is that irritating? Why is that hurtful even? I imagine there are two possibilities here. One is that she might think that any attempt to try to characterize transgenderism in a way that minimizes some aspects of it might be problematic for those people who actually suffer from this condition, if I can call it suffer, because I imagine it's probably not a comfortable thing to experience, if only because we live in a world that's not predominantly transgenders. That's one possible interpretation, not justification. The second possibility, which I think is more likely, is that she doesn't even think there is any social contagion aspect of this, right? So whereas the first possibility, she might acknowledge that there is a social contagion, but she doesn't like the idea of talking about it because it might minimize the actual instances. Well, here, she doesn't think it's a social contagion at all, in which case you're minimizing all of transgenderism, because there is no part of transgenderism that can be honestly, in her perspective, attributed to a social contagion. From that lens, it's completely easy for me to see why she would be so upset about that comparison. In that sense, regardless of the nuance, regardless of the context, the problem is that he is making this attribution in the first place. And it also explains why she would not feel the need to contextualize what he said, because for all intents and purposes, that nuance is irrelevant to how she perceived him. And this is the only explanation that makes sense to me, because it completely explains why she would be seemingly trying to vilify him, why she seems so palpably upset and hurt. I mean, think about it, right? Let's try to put ourselves in her shoes. I get that it's a frustrating way to formulate a question, but try to put yourself in her shoes. We all know what a heart attack is, or we have a general conception if you're not medically inclined. So assuming that you heard someone talking about heart attacks and saying that a good portion or even some of heart attacks is caused by social contagion, you're probably going to think that that person is being absurd. Because by definition, a heart attack is something that is physiological. It's a pathology of the heart. So trying to explain that away with social contagion just doesn't make sense. And I believe that she is probably holding transgenderism to a similar level of certainty as far as this condition goes, that anybody who claims to be transgender or anybody who is confused about their sex and wants to go through this transitional process is equally as genuine about it and should not be minimized. And I believe this is really what explains her level of frustration about this. In that sense, personally, I can empathize with her. I'm not justifying her behavior. I'm not justifying how she's characterizing him, but I just don't think that if that is your perspective, you can have any viewpoint that charitably interprets what he's trying to say here. Because first you have to address that more root problem of, or root disagreement of whether there's any part of transgenderism that is even explicable by social contagion. I believe that is the main question here. And I wish, if there is something that I wish, we're going to keep watching this, but if there's something that I wish he had addressed, I wish it was that. I think that might have bridged the gap, or that might have offered a little bit more, progress in this obviously hopeless conversation.
Are a consequence of any attitude whatsoever towards their hypothetically transgender
lack
status.
Of social acceptance, which is definitely cultivated by comments like yours that deny the existence of trans people.
What makes you think you know what you're talking about? I cannot understand for a moment.
Lack of social acceptance is a driving force behind trans youth committing suicide. And I'm asking you to explain why you feel it's appropriate to deny the existence of transgender people.
I can't possibly imagine anybody sequencing a collection of questions more cliched, formulaic, and accusatory than the ones that you just managed. You don't have any idea about what you're talking about, and your confidence far exceeds your competence.
I'm friends with many transgender individuals.
I also don't know who educated you at this fine university, but they're doing a damn dismal job.
Dr. Peterson, I think.
Yeah. I don't know what to. I mean, at this point, it's like a runaway train. There is no stopping this. She has her ideology completely calcified, or at least it's definitely not going to be adjusted to any extent in this format. And he's obviously very upset, rightfully, about the way that she accused him. So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, this conversation is already doomed to failure.
I also don't know who educated you at this fine university, but they're doing a damn dismal job.
Dr. Peterson, I think one of the things at Oxford Union we welcome all kind of questions, and I think I would appreciate if the substance of what she's asking.
There was no substance. You can't answer the substance of a question when you're asked a question with no substance. So,
denying the existence of an entire community and comparing transgender people to participating in a sociological contagion.
They are participating in a sociological contagion, obviously. Why in the world do you think there's been an explosion in prevalence with regards to transgender identification among juvenile women? Why do you think that? Do you know that that's the pattern of social contagions for the last 350 years? Do you know it's always juvenile women? It was eating disorders. It was cutting. It was the eating disorders were anorexia and bulimia. In Freud's time, it was hysteria.
In this interaction, I don't think there's any path forward that does not involve that qualification, that transgenderism, at least part of it, can be explained by a social contagion. Because then she would have to either admit or deny that there is any part of it that has to do with that, and probably explain what makes her so confident about that if she thinks that there is no aspect of transgenderism that is attributed to a social contagion. But now what they're talking about is all of it. Is all of transgenderism correlated with a social contagion or caused by a social contagion? Again, I'm pretty sure Jordan Peterson is not saying that, but then again, he's not qualifying it either. And I just think this conversation, while they're in the ballpark of the disagreement, it's still not on track to any resolution.
It was the eating disorders were anorexia and bulimia. In Freud's time, it was hysteria.
So I take a lot of issue with you pretending to care about women as an avenue for perpetuating hate towards minority groups. You did this earlier in your conversation with the president, and you're doing it once more. But
you really are something.
Okay.
Thank you.
So,
yeah.
Thank you, Arushi. We'll go to the next question. Anyone else? A lot of people. Would you like to choose someone this time?
Yeah, way too much frustration for that conversation to be salvaged. If someone came to me with such a question, I'd probably most likely react the same way as Jordan Peterson did. In fact, he might have handled himself better. But I truly believe that if we understand why people present themselves in a certain way, it makes it that much more easier for us to empathize with them. If we understand that her coming in guns blazing was as a result of someone who genuinely believes that he is portraying transgenderism in a way that belittles them and probably puts their safety in danger, she genuinely believes that. I don't think she's faking that, right? I don't think that's disingenuous. And he genuinely believes that she's there to tarnish his reputation. Well, it's completely predictable how this is how the conversation would turn out. So again, while I think I see the thread they could have pulled on to have a more fruitful conversation here, I think the frustration just completely stacked the odds out of their favor. The frustration on both sides. She came in with a lot of frustration, and she was hell-bent on also frustrating him. I don't think it was intentional on both sides. I think that's the point that I'm trying to get across. Looking at the comment section and even my initial reaction to this interaction, it's completely easy to denigrate her for the way that she presented herself in this interaction. But that's why I think it's so important too that we understand why someone would react that way, why she would present herself that way. And I think the most likely explanation that I can think of is that she genuinely believes what she's saying. She genuinely believes that he's being hurtful towards transgender people, that he is genuinely being dismissive of them. And I think these conversations have to be had, as frustrating as they might be. I think she should have done a much better job putting aside her ego and putting aside her frustration and come to this conversation with more curiosity. And I think he should have responded with that empathy, that this is someone who is obviously deeply frustrated for reasons as misguided as they might be, and try to, I think he did try. I think he did try, but again, I think they just were not on, they just had such a fine window, such a narrow window to address exactly what was the disagreement here. And so it's no wonder that they were not able to land on that. And in this limited space that they have to conversate, it's predictable.
Like an accusation of hate particularly one that's formulated in that manner, that begins with the proposition that I was comparing transgender people to those who participated in satanic rituals, which is not at all what I said or meant on the Joe Rogan special. Is not a question with substance, and that's for sure. It's not a question at all. It's a form of moralizing Pharisaism that's designed to reputation savage the target of the question in precisely the manner that female personalities characterized by antisocial bullying are particularly proficient at. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that question.
Your question.
Hello. So my question...
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that conversation did not end well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Please share your comments, like, subscribe if you enjoyed watching this analysis, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.